So the first paper being presented today is titled Preparing School Leaders for Social Justice Through Democratic Practices and Critical Consciousness. The authors are Dr. Hazel Carter, who is an associate professor and chair of the Department of Leadership and Human Development at the School of Education, the City College of New York. Dr. Robert Lubetsky, who is a clinical professor and director of the program in educational leadership at the Department of Leadership and Human Development at the School of Education at the City College of New York. And Lydia Colón-Bomani, who is a deputy superintendent at the New York City Department of Education and an adjunct professor in the program in educational leadership at the City College of New York. And I will let you guys start by sharing your paper and take it from here. Hazel, Lydia, which one of you is sharing the paper?
Lydia.
Okay, Lydia? You're muted.
It shared before. Give me a second.
Okay,
Sharing now.
sure. There you go.
So thank you, Julia. It's a pleasure to be in this conference, an important conference. We look forward to the other papers that are going to be presented and to the conversation we hope will follow the presentations. Our presentation and discussion is focused on how City College of New York Program in Educational Leadership prepares school leaders for social justice through democratic practices and critical consciousness. This presentation is also framed by the quotation on the slide that begins, school leaders promoting environments conducive to empowering and producing teacher leaders exemplify a paradigm shift with the decisions made by those working most closely with students rather than those at the top of the pyramid. Empowerment is further supported when school staff function in an atmosphere of trust and mutual respect that allows them to grow and thrive as professionals. This can only occur in an environment where all members of the community, teachers, counselors, students, and parents feel comfortable with their colleagues in school leadership and where they make decisions that matter in the classroom and in their schools. Because we want our presentation to provoke questions, we hope that you will be able to engage what we present in following Frere's method of dialogic problem posing and inquiry. First, some operational definitions. Social justice, which is the core focus of our work in preparing school leaders, is concerned with creating a more just society where privilege and opportunities are not dependent on wealth, class, race, or institutionalized privilege. This is foundational and organizes our work. It is infused in all of our courses. We want to prepare school leaders for social justice through democratic practices because we believe that anything less must necessarily be autocratic and antithetical to our concern with social justice and the development of critical consciousness. Dewey argued that democracy, rather than being defined as a particular structure or organizational form, was more than anything else what he called conjoint associated living. We know from lots of research that trust is a key element in schools. That is, the relationship among members of the school define both how they experience the school, how they experience each other, and how they experience the formal content of school. We also know that the so-called hidden curriculum, often not so hidden, is far more influential than the enacted curriculum. We take these issues up later in our presentation. The final element in our title introduces the notion of critical consciousness, upon which everything else rests. By critical consciousness, we mean a dialogic process which produces a deeper understanding. We not only interrogate our beliefs, but we want to understand where we're located in the world and how that location influences and informs our beliefs and who we believe we are. Through this interrogation, we enlarge our understanding of the world. In Freudian terms, we're reading the world while we're reading the word. By practicing critical pedagogy, students come to recognize the connections between their individual problems and the social contexts within which these problems are embedded. This approach is also foundational and infused into everything we do. Instructors in the program must, by their action, reflect this approach. That is, it must apply to them personally. The old adage applies. Who we are is reflected in how we understand and act in the world, and these actions in turn reflect that understanding. Instructors cannot stand outside it. They are very much a part of it. These three elements are intertwined and in synergistic relationship. Each affects the other. That is, a concern for social justice must be concerned with developing a critical consciousness, which fundamentally means being self-critical of how we understand the world in order to interrogate that understanding. It also means being concerned with how democracy is practiced in schools and in its relationship to students, staff, and the community, and how democratic practices affects the way our critical consciousness informs our understanding of social justice. With this foundational understanding, we'll move into a description of specific aspects of the two courses that are taught in our program. These are only two of the courses that are taught. We don't have time to discuss all of the courses that are taught, but the two courses that we will discuss are key foundation aspects of our program. And I'll turn the program over to
Lydia.
Resident Superintendent, Deputy Superintendent, excuse me, Lydia Colón-Bomani.
So when we do this coursework with building people who are candidates for building leadership, we look at promising practices in school models. We start our proposal or those three elements of critical conscious democratic practices in pursuit of social justice. We talk about school leaders promoting environments that are conducive to empowering and producing teacher leaders. This example here is when we look at models where there is an increased level of student engagement, achievement, and participation. We find that examples of this practice, similar to what you see here, which is a master schedule of a school, that across grades, the building leader has strategically programmed teachers with their colleagues to plan horizontally across content, but also made room for the practice to happen vertically within content. The planning of aligning teachers, common planning time alongside union-required prep and lunchtime is a way that we see evidence of a school leader demonstrating the importance of time spent to collaborate and making time for the deep planning of students with instruction and curriculum. This is an investment in teacher collaboration that the leader has provided to those closest to the student. Then we look at this idea of empowerment, right? The empowerment of these teacher leaders and teams is most productive in an atmosphere of trust. In a school model, that trust could be, and in this particular model, is defined as measured by willingness and capacity. A practice would be a building leader along with teacher leaders would place themselves and teacher members on this matrix for any given activity. For example, if we had a group of teacher leaders and we wanted to determine if we trusted a set of teachers to work with students to read and understand their transcripts, we would place each of those team members on the matrix and discuss next steps for moving forward to get the best of the practice to the students and what they need. In order to have these high levels of commitment and empowerment, that can be seen working well in school models that have several levels of distributive leadership. And in the model that you see here, where the school community leaders have clearly defined areas of responsibility along with structures, processes, and practices that allow for them to collaborate and discuss the overlaps to collaborate on and the gaps that may exist between what many schools define as academic and non-academic spaces. In New York City Department of Education, every school leader is required to provide an organization chart to Central which typically is written in a hierarchical manner. Here, the attempt of the school leader is to show a flat model of organization where everyone's input is equally important and informs the decisions for students and families with authentic contribution. In this model, you see that this is a community school, which through this structure aligns with practices you'll hear described by my colleague, Dr. Carter, about partnerships, which this school created via the community school model in partnership with a community-based organization. Dr. Carter?
Thank you, Lydia. So how do we pull all of this together? We know that social justice issues which are embedded in the community are played out in various ways in our schools, making it extremely difficult for schools to achieve their mission. Next slide. Our education leadership program is part of a school of education whose faculty, including those in teacher education, bring social justice issues to the forefront of their work. For example, immigration and DACA, forums on teaching, learning, leading for democracy in the context of COVID, and systemic injustice. And my colleague, Dr. Lubetsky, who you heard from earlier, was instrumental in framing a statement on social injustice in response to the 2016 general election. And this statement was recognized by New York's governor. In their first course, which is called Building School Community, leadership students are presented with a perspective that schools cannot do it alone, and school leaders cannot address social justice issues in isolation. Their first assignment is a community walk of the location of their school, where they document what they see: businesses, recreational facilities, anything that will help them understand what their students experience each day. For those teachers, who do not live in the community in which their school resides, this activity is an eye-opener. And they often point out the disparity of resources in New York City. For example, South Bronx versus the Upper West Side, and how these inequities in resources impact student progress in schools. They then take this information to prepare a proposal for funding, which is modeled after the federal Gear Up Community Partnership proposal. And this grant writing activity highlights the various constituencies who come together to support early intervention programs designed to increase college attendance and success and raise the expectations of low-income students. The main idea is that grants can be used by school leaders to tackle social justice issues while facilitating and managing sustainable connections with community stakeholders. Many students, after they complete this course, they use a proposal or elements of it to seek funding for a program in their school. Next slide. So as they think about writing this grant and dealing with the scope of social injustice, there are a few areas that need to be addressed, and these include: how do you identify and assemble appropriate stakeholders to form partnerships? How do you create and develop a shared vision for change? How do you identify school staff and community representatives? And how do you create this clear structure that will define roles and responsibilities between the individuals of the organization? Next slide. So students consider what type of collaboration is best suited to address this particular social justice issue they are working on in their grant. So for example, is the project going to be a one-time thing, or when the school is cooperating and coordinating, which you would see in items 2 and 3, which suggests low levels of collaboration? Or will it be a long-term sustainable collaboration as we see in 4 and particularly number 5? At this point, students will know that decision-making process of stakeholders are very different from schools, and the culture of the different stakeholders is an eye-opener for them. They're very different. And it's really important to develop or to plan time for collaborative planning. Next slide, please. So this course, Building School Community, also focuses on an important yet often ignored constituent in the community, the higher education institution. And we use LaGuardia Community College, which has been replicated across the country, as an example of a higher education institution that has worked closely with the community and with school to address social justice issues. leadership students explore some of LaGuardia's exemplary collaborative programs, including Middle College. And Middle College, as you know, the goals were to reduce the dropout rate by improving student academic performance, to improve student self-concept, and to enhance college and career options by helping students reach their full potential. It's housed in a community college, and the school is an example of a long-term, sustained collaborative between New York City Department of Ed and LaGuardia Community College. And LaGuardia was actually asked by the Chancellor of the University of New York to provide a plan to increase high school retention, to improve graduation rates at the secondary level, and to attract adolescents to higher education. And I'm going to refer to the diagram here. So under institutional mission, the mission of LaGuardia and the mission of Middle College was similar, and they both focus on problems of high school retention. Obviously, LaGuardia would have other missions as a institution of higher education. It also, LaGuardia enjoyed wide structural freedom, so its policy was based on experiential learning, and which really allowed it to work closely with schools and colleges. And the idea here is that if colleges don't work with schools, then you would not, or you may not have students coming into colleges. So it makes sense for them to work closely together, and the earlier the better. Under management strategies, and students were really interested about this area, they saw that middle college students were able to take courses at LaGuardia. Both the school and college had the same calendar, same club hours, and the academic freedom, which was something normally associated with college faculty, was very prevalent in the school. So while Middle College is located on a college campus, we know that not all high schools are structured in the same manner. So when we talk about lessons learned from this model, our leadership students talk clearly about three main things. One, the school's emphasis on guidance counseling. The freedom of the school faculty is something that really they focus on. And the whole idea of school students coexisting with college students on a daily basis. And they also talk about levels of collaboration and how that could change depending on the leadership at the school and the leadership at the college, and what happens when leaders leave the institution. So this course and several others in our program engage students in exploring democratic practices by adopting a collaborative approach that brings community stakeholders together to address social justice issues. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, we're going to leave you with a couple of questions to think about. Food for thought. What is the role of a school of education? And how should schools of education resolve the contradiction between credentialing requirements versus engaging in more liberatory practices? What should schools of education be organized around? What should they promote? How should schools of education respond to the events in the school, community, state, country, and the world? Thank you for listening.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Really interesting and so timely. So the next paper is titled Policies for the Identification, Assessment, and Reclassification of English Language Learners, a National Study. And the author is Ajay Srikanth, who is a PhD student at the Rutgers Graduate School of Education. And this research is part of Ajay's dissertation research. And I'm very excited to see it because I'm on his committee and this is my first time seeing this work. So I'm very extra excited to see what he has found. So Ajay, take it away.
All right, thanks, Julia. Hold on, let me share the screen. Okay, is everyone able to see my screen?
You might want to go into presentation mode.
Okay.
There you go.
All right, so the focus of my dissertation research is thinking about the ways that policies can improve outcomes for English language learners. So think long term, I'm looking more at the intersection of school finance and policies for English language learners. But in order to get to that point, we really need to define what an ELL is and how that variation exists across states. So this is what that presentation will cover. So according to the National Center for Education Statistics, the population of ELLs, also known as English learners in some states, the horrible term limited English proficient at the federal level, which implies a very deficit-oriented framework, or the more progressive term emergent bilinguals, which views these groups of students as an asset rather than a deficit in terms of their knowledge of their native language and culture, has grown from about 8% of public school students in the year 2000 to about 9.6% in 2016. There's approximately 5 million students identified as ELLs. In states such as North Carolina and Virginia, the population of ELLs has nearly tripled between 2000 and 2016, which surprised me because when you think of ELL populations, southern states such as North Carolina and Virginia would not be the first places I would think of, but it shows kind of the shift in what schools need to be responsible for and how their student populations and demographics are changing. So this table shows states with the highest total populations of ELLs. Keep in mind, a lot of these states have the highest populations of people. So unsurprisingly, California, Texas, Florida, and New York have the most ELLs in general. That is really not a surprise to anyone. What did surprise me was that North Carolina and Virginia were also on this list, indicating the demographic changes of both schools and the United States as a whole. Same data expressed different way on the next slide, which shows them as a concentration of the total school population. So California and Texas, unsurprisingly, are also still at the top, but this is where you get some changes in the way this data is displayed, because Nevada and New Mexico now move up the list in terms of percentage ELL in their schools. I was also very surprised to see Kansas on this list of states with the highest concentration of ELLs, indicating that some of the demographics in towns in Kansas may be changing at the time. Most common languages for English language learners or emergent bilinguals. Unsurprisingly, Spanish is the most common language, with 3/4 of English language learners as Spanish speakers. Other common languages include Arabic, Chinese, Vietnamese, and Somali. But one important note with this stat is there's a lot of regional variation in what the most common languages are. For example, if you go to Chicago, I believe the second most common language after Spanish, the next two would be Polish, because Chicago has a large population of Polish-speaking immigrants, and Chinese. So there's a substantial variation. And I believe in New York City, Bengali is one of the most common languages, but I would have to double check that statistic. So we get into the federal definition of what an English language learner is, or the unfortunate term that they use, limited English proficient. So federal law divides limited English proficient as a student who is age 3 to 21, enrolled or preparing to enroll in elementary school or secondary school, who's not born in the United States, or whose native language is a language other than English, who is a Native American or Alaska Native, who comes from an environment where a language other than English has had a significant impact on the individual's level of English language proficiency, whose native language is a language other than English, and whose difficulties in speaking, reading, writing, or understanding the English language may be sufficient to deny the individual either the ability to meet the state's proficient level on achievement of state assessments, the ability to successfully achieve in classrooms where the language of instruction is English, or the opportunity to fully participate in society. As you can see with this federal definition, it leaves a lot to be defined by state policy, as we have a very decentralized education system in the United States. So a lot of these terms are not quite clear-cut. So that leads to the crux of this presentation, federal requirements for English language learners with respect to assessment. So important note, this presentation won't cover the heart of education for ELLs, which is programming, instruction, funding, which is the core of what happens and why this is a protective subcategory under the Equal Educational Opportunities Act of 1974, and why such seminal litigation as Lau versus Nichols led to increases in civil rights for English language learners. What I will be talking about mostly is assessment for ELLs. So under Every Student Succeed Act of 2015, formerly known as No Child Left Behind, states must have standardized statewide procedures for identifying ELLs and for determining when special language services are no longer needed, also known as reclassification or exit procedures. ELLs must take English language proficiency assessments. We're going to cover what those assessments look like and how they vary by state. States must include an indicator in their statewide accountability system that will measure ELL's annual progress in achieving English language proficiency. So one thing you'll notice as a consistent theme is that this construct of English language proficiency is seen as a very important, if not the defining goal for English language learners, which is oriented at a very deficit-based framework and seems to focus more on attaining a measure of English language proficiency rather than developing academic and social skills and building a whole student. And we're going to see this in how students define English language proficiency and also how they create accountability for that one measure. States must define what it means to reach proficiency in English as measured by statewide annual English language proficiency assessment and within a state-determined timeline. States must establish ambitious long-term goals and measurements of interim progress for increasing the percentage of ELs making progress. So the idea here is that if a student starts at, let's say, level 1, each year they move up one level so that by year 5, let's say, they become proficient in English. Although we know children don't develop in a linear fashion, state policy has embedded this in accountability systems. States must include English language learners in their annual tests in ELA and math and disaggregate gaps between ELLs and non-ELLs. So this varies by state, and states may choose to exclude newcomer ELLs and other students who may not be ready to participate in a testing regime. So this is a brief overview of the procedures for identification and reclassification of English language learners. There are some useful flowcharts as well up on state websites. So we're going to get to, on the next slide, the first step for identifying English language learners is to issue a home language survey. There is significant variation by district and by state in the number of questions and the language used in a home language survey. But essentially what a home language survey asks is there a language other than English spoken at home? Or is your child's primary language a language other than English? If the student answers yes to one or more of the questions on the home language survey, generally what districts do is they conduct a follow-up interview to ensure that students did not answer any of the questions incorrectly and that the students fully understood what they were responding to. In nearly every district, the home language survey is offered in multiple languages, usually the most prevalent languages that occur within the district. Third step is to administer the appropriate grade level English language proficiency screener. If the student scores above the threshold cut score, student is not identified as an English language learner. Students with scores below the cut score are identified as ELLs and placed in a program after their parents are notified. So when the decision process of placing an ELL in a program occurs, parent may refuse the placement of services, but they cannot refuse annual testing, and will be continued to be labeled as an English language learner until they test out or meet whatever the state criteria may be. So for the exit reclassification, the student must meet all of the required guidelines for testing out. And an important note here is that even after they exit the services or are reclassified, must be continued to be monitored by schools and districts for at least 2 years following reclassification. So I put up a few examples of home language surveys from different districts throughout the country. Here's one from Chicago Public Schools, which uses a very simple 2 questions. Is a language other than English spoken in your home? Does the student speak a language other than English? You answer yes to either question, you're put in the screener process. So you can see examples in Spanish, Polish, Chinese, Arabic. There's additional languages on this form. The New York State Home Language Survey, which uses a more in-depth questionnaire and also has a follow-up interview process and a records review. LA Unified has 4 questions on it. And is generally issued statewide. Districts are allowed to add questions to their home language survey, but there is generally state guidelines for a minimum number of questions that must be asked. So LA Unified includes: which language did your child learn when he or she began to talk? What language does your child most frequently speak at home? Which language do you, the parents or guardians, most frequently use when speaking with their child? And which language is most often spoken by adults in the home? And then finally, one from Paterson, New Jersey, which has 7 questions there, along with a records review process. So this one appears to have a little bit more of a flowchart feel, where if you answer one question this way, then you proceed to a different part. So when looking through home language surveys, the one for Newark, New Jersey looked very similar to this. Okay, so a general overview of English language proficiency screeners and assessments. So for most grades, they include sections in reading, writing, listening, and speaking. For younger children, pre-K and kindergarten, they only include listening and speaking. There are performance descriptors for each domain, specifically what children can and should be able to do to demonstrate mastery in a particular domain. And this occurs for all of the domains. There's a set of standards for this. The most commonly known ones are the WIDA standards, which we'll get to in a second. There's a cut score, meaning a minimum level of proficiency for identification and reclassification. Some states only require proficiency for overall, meaning there's a summative score for all 4 sections, while others require it for multiple sections or all sections. So for example, some state could require proficient for where you can do poorly in one section, but master all 3 other sections, and it doesn't matter, while some require you to meet a minimum cut score for every section of the test. The weight for each section changes by grade level. Upper grades are weighted more towards reading and writing, while lower grades are weighted more towards listening and speaking. So how are the tests decided upon, and how do states decide what the English language proficiency screeners and assessments are going to be? So generally, the way it breaks down is that tests decided to join what are called testing consortia. So testing consortia are essentially these large companies and assessment design companies that states join, where they issue the English language proficiency screeners and assessment. The most commonly known one and most prevalent one throughout the country is one called the World Class Instructional Design and Assessment Consortium, better known as WIDA. The WIDA test for English language proficiency for grades 1 through 12 is known as Access 2.0. So as you can see in this table, 36 out of 51 states, that includes Washington, D.C., are members of this WIDA consortium. Another 8 belong to what's called the English Language Proficiency Assessment for the 21st Century, ELPA 21. Initially, it started out of Stanford University, and I think Oregon and Washington were the first 2 members, but it's expanded. 5 states are independent, but as you'll see, those 5 states are critically important and include a lot of the states with the largest ELL populations. And then 2 states, I believe, Mississippi and Connecticut, belong to a consortium called Los Links, which is another English language proficiency consortium. So this map is taken from a report from 2020 from the Migration Policy Institute. What's notable about this map is you'll see the states that decided to pursue and develop their own English language proficiency assessments, those being California, Texas, New York, Arizona, being like the 4 largest. Also, interestingly, there's a whole politics of testing consortia, not dissimilar to the Park Smarter Balance Common Core debate, where Florida initially was going to be a part of one testing consortium, but joined the WIDA consortium in 2015. California was also initially scheduled to be a part of ELPA 21, but backed out at the last minute and decided to pursue their own set of tests. New Jersey, the state where we are right now, is a part of the WIDA consortium. So, scoring and proficiency levels by test. The WIDA screener is online, and the WIDA ELP assessment is known as Access 2.0. For kindergarten and first grade, and first semester grade 1, they use the model and the WAPT. For preschool students, there's another company that does that screener known as Ballard and Ty, and the name of the test is known as the pre-IPT. Access 2.0 has proficiency levels from 1 to 6, 6 being the highest for each domain, and an overall proficiency level. They also have subscores, one known as literacy, which is the combined proficiency level of reading and writing. There's oral proficiency, which is listening and speaking. And then ELPA 21 has levels from 1 to 5 for each domain and an overall proficiency level. They've also created 3 proficiency descriptors. Emerging, which is students who score 1 and 2 on all sections. Progressing, which are students who score below 5 or 4 on any sections, but above 1 and 2. And then proficient for students who score 5s and 4s on all sections, reading, writing, listening, speaking. Los Links has proficiency levels from 1 to 5 for each domain and an overall proficiency level. So criteria for reclassification. So every state has a cut score for their English proficiency assessment for ELLs to be reclassified. So this is what I found quite alarming is, however, only 11 states use additional criteria other than a score on a single exam to reclassify students. So only 11 states use additional criteria to reclassify ELLs, such as grades, teacher recommendations, and portfolios. Some states have created a committee to make determinations for reclassification. However, the rest of the states use a single score on a single test one day to reclassify students, which in my view violates Campbell's law, which says the more a quantitative social indicator is used for any high stakes decision, the more subject that indicator is to corruption, leading to harmful practices such as teaching to the test. These states that use a more comprehensive method of reclassification include Alabama, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Florida, Massachusetts, Michigan, Missouri, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Texas. And then, so what I wanted to do next is kind of do, since we don't have time to look at all 50 states, was to look at a general overview of 6 different states, just what consortium they belong to, the screener, assessment, and how they reclassify students. So California, the state with the largest percentage and population of ELLs, they use a new test they developed. Initially, they used a test called the CELT. They developed a new system of assessment called the English Language Proficiency Assessments for California. So the screener is called the initial LPAC. The assessment is called the summative LPAC. And they created 4 different proficiency levels for this. Novice EL, intermediate EL, and IFEP, initial fluent English proficient. Sorry, that's 3 levels. So those are their levels for for the screener. For the summative EL, they have levels 1 through 4. To test out of being an EL, on the screener, you need to get a level of initial fluent English proficient. And on the English proficiency assessment at the end of the year, you need a level 4. They do include other criteria to be reclassified as an EL. These other criteria include teacher evaluation, including the student's academic performance, parent opinion and consultation, comparison of performance in basic skills against an empirically established range of performance in basic skills based on the performance of English proficient students of the same age. So there is at least multiple indicators used to make a high stakes decision. New Jersey also uses multiple indicators. You can see they have a 4.5 cut score to test out, but they conduct a records review. They don't specify what the additional indicators exactly should be, but they mention things such as grade, teacher recommendations, other test scores, and classroom observations. As you can see here, New York uses a single test to make that decision. So 3 more states as examples. So the one I want to highlight here is Texas, because Texas actually on their website indicated that due to changes in schooling as a result of COVID-19, they have changed their procedures for identifying and reclassifying ELLs. So Texas actually is flexible in terms of the screener and test that they use for English language proficiency. So they have one test called the Texas English Language Proficiency Assessment System, and then they also allow for the use of lost links. So their procedure for this school year.
AJ, I'm sorry, you're at 22 minutes.
Okay, let me wrap up. So conclusions quickly. States and districts vary widely in their HLS. While the majority of states are in the WIDA consortium, 3 of the 4 biggest states are not in WIDA and do their own thing. Most states do not use additional criteria. And as I mentioned before, the inclusion of English language proficiency and growth towards proficiency and accountability means that districts are incentivized to teach to the test and focus on English proficiency rather than academic content knowledge. Okay, I'll wrap up.
Great, thank you very much. Sorry to cut you off. We want to make sure there's some time for questions. It's really amazing data, and it's very exciting that you've been able to collect this. So, okay, and our third paper is titled Building a Free University Through Student Organizing. And we have 5 authors, 4 of whom will be presenting today. Hailey Lamb, who completed Brooklyn College this spring and will be starting a master's degree in liberal studies at the CUNY Graduate Center. Chris Mejia, who completed a BA at CUNY this spring and is participating in the union semester through the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. Mel Corning, who completed a BA at CUNY this spring and is working as a teacher. There's a theme here. Lucien, Baskin, who also completed his BA at CUNY this spring and will be starting a PhD in urban education at the CUNY Graduate Center this fall. And Sarah Gafur, who is beginning her senior year at Brooklyn College this fall. And Sarah is not here, so the other 4 authors will be presenting the paper.
Awesome. I'm going to start it off. I want to thank everybody for being here today, and I'm happy the panel is continuing even though we are in a moment of crisis. So I'm going to start off with a short history of CUNY. CUNY was founded in 1847 as a free academy to provide an accessible education to working class immigrant New Yorkers. And for the majority of its history, CUNY has provided a tuition-free education, benefiting the white working class the most. In the midst of social movements like the civil rights struggle and protests against the Vietnam War, social movements that actually resonate with today's current social uprisings, Black and Latino students called for something called open admissions. And what open admissions was, means is that any student who graduated from an NYC high school had a seat reserved at CUNY. Throughout that decade, in the 60s, Black and Latino enrollment at City College would be less than 10% of the university, at City College, even though the 2 groups had come to constitute nearly half of the students in the city's public schools. So open admissions was actually a very significant gains for students of color. Yet, these reforms were shortly taken away. The city imposed tuition in 1976, the first year that the incoming class was majority students of color, under a guise of austerity, which some consider to be a racially motivated manufactured crisis against working class New Yorkers. This made the new university no longer free and progressively inaccessible to working class communities of color, which reflects the wider practice of racial exclusion at CUNY in post-war New York. So who are we and what is our vision? Free CUNY comes out of this radical traditions of students 68 and 69, in the sense that it's a militant preservation of what we understand to be a common dispossession in the university, but also broader society. We are a group of CUNY students, faculty, staff, and community members who are working towards an anti-racist tuition-free CUNY. Free means more than just no tuition. It means free Metro cards, it means free childcare, access to food, access to housing, student stipends, also hiring practices that actually reflect the student body. Open admissions, no gator ID checks, no cops on our campuses. There's been experience, particularly in my former school, Brooklyn College, where the NYPD has spied on Muslim students, and many more things. Our vision of a free CUNY is a liberating one. It's a project of creation. We believe that by building a multiracial class alliance and rooting ourselves in the community, we can actually actualize the socially transformative potential of community. The goal for CUNY is not solely a tuition-free university. Through building community and calling for social justice, we hope to re-envision the future and win gains for public education and broader society. To succeed, we see our struggles as one focus on building a movement that transcends the particular demands of a free university. Our vision aspires to fight for social equality for all. Like other fights, the struggle for a free CUNY represents a new type of vision, which has not fully formed, but whose foundations are there to be built upon. And I hope our talk today will give you insight as to how we are building upon the foundation to actually actualize that vision. Hailey will speak more to that.
Hi, thank you, Chris.
Anytime.
Okay, so when we fight for a free CUNY, we also understand that reforms do not work. We cannot fight for tuition freezes, police reform, or programs that offer only a few groups of people on campuses free tuition, like CUNY, ASAP, Excelsior, Macaulay, though they help. Because as we have seen, universities respond to these reformist demands by offering watered down versions of these reforms and do so in ways that allow them to rescind whatever resources are provided on their terms, exclude people who need it, and be used by the university to dictate who is deserving and undeserving. When we make maximalist demands, we also know that people need help right now. And that we cannot just sit around making demands of university built to preserve and uplift whiteness and white people. So it means that we need to find ways to enact change without relying on the benevolence of the administration. At the beginning of the transition from in-person to online learning, we began pushing professors to take on an A for all policy. Our primary approach included providing students with a network of support that better positions their own self-advocacy work. Many professors responded positively and in agreement, letting their students know that they were guaranteed an A at the end of the course, acknowledging that during a nationwide pandemic, there was no way that students would be able to produce the work that the university unfairly required of them. Here, we reject the university system of evaluating and instead imagine a university where learning is not bounded by racist, ableist, sexist, and classist markers of success, and argue that this should be a permanent change made to the university. It also means supporting the people and spaces who are already realizing, practicing, and oriented toward transforming CUNY spaces into one that serves and engages with the communities these universities impose upon. The farm workers at Kingsborough Community College do this work. KCC Urban Farm is a quarter-acre farm on the campus of Kingsborough Community College that produces 3,000 pounds of free food every season for students and their families. The farm is run by Black and Indigenous POC students and queer and trans students, and is a safe space for BIPOC queer and trans students. On this farm, Black and brown students feed, teach, and care for Black and brown students. The workers on this farm, not the university, transform the space into one that feeds its peers and communities. We must protect, sustain, and support spaces like KCC Urban Farm, which faces massive cuts this upcoming month. So we're also asking everyone on this call to sign on this petition. We'll link into the chat, but it's tinyurl.com/KCC Urban Farm petition. Please also go, if you want to the Free CUNY Instagram, which has, you see on the screen, these letters where alumni from this farm wrote to the administration just saying these heartfelt words about how important this farm is to them and to people. And if you want to follow KC Urban Farm, you can see the kind of work they do and continue to do during the middle of a pandemic. I'll turn it to Lucien. Lucien.
Lucien, you're probably muted. No, we're not hearing you.
I'm not muted.
Oh, now
Can
we
you
hear you. Yep, now
Oh,
we can
sorry.
hear you.
Okay. Yeah, so I just want to thank everyone for showing up today, and to Julia and the organizers of this conference for having us. So Free University is an abolitionist university, and an abolitionist university can only exist in an abolitionist society. This has been a guiding belief as Free CUNY has struggled for the abolition of the carceral state, as it is manifested in and beyond CUNY. While there is anti-carceral organizing and scholarship that positions education and schooling in opposition to the prison industrial complex, there is also a mainstream discourse around the school-to-prison pipeline, as well as critiques of the school-to-prison pipeline framework that understand the school, or in this case the university, itself to be a carceral space. Following the lead of this body of work, and acknowledging Fred Moten and Stefano Harney's warning that, and I quote, "The slogan of the left, then, universities not jails, marks a choice that may not be possible. In other words, perhaps more universities promotes more jails," end quote. We aim to do abolitionist work from within an institution that is foundational to the prison industrial complex. This necessitates a deep analysis of the carceral workings of the university, one that looks beyond the removal of the NYPD from CUNY campuses, or even the abolition of CUNY security, to issues such as the role of CUNY in the policing of immigrant and international students, as we've seen this past week with Trump's order around international students, the role of CUNY in the gentrification of New York City, the ways in which scholarship and research produced within the university both strengthens and enlarges the prison industrial complex, and the training and recruitment of students for careers in the criminal punishment legal system. While organizing for a well-funded, robust public university, an institution we see as central to an abolitionist society, we understand that CUNY as it exists today is an exclusionary institution that reinforces hierarchies and deems certain people and communities disposable and in need of policing, incarceration, and state control. In solidarity with the FTP3 call to action, Free CUNY organized a student speak out alongside organizations such as the People's Cultural Plan, the Yaya Youth Network, and Teens Take Charge. On the morning of January 31st, a few dozen public school and CUNY students, educators, and community members took to the stairs of the NYC Department of Education to refuse policing in New York City schools and streets. As we held colorful banners with messages such as abolition, decolonization, liberation, and cops out of CUNY, folks spoke about their experiences with policing in school and on their commute to and from school, as well as the repression of student organizing. The 5 demands of the demonstration were an end to educational apartheid, a free and fully funded CUNY, a working public transportation system, no cops or recruiters in schools, and the abolition of the NYPD. We have continued to pursue abolitionist organizing in the past few months, as CUNY and the city shut down before rising up. In the wake of the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and other Black people killed by the state, students and other community members at CUNY have not only taken to the streets, but have also fought for the decarceration of the university. Emerging out of the rebellion in the streets and decades of anti-police organizing at CUNY, folks across campuses, from Lehman in the Northwest Bronx to Kingsborough in Manhattan Beach, have organized to cut ties with the NYPD and remove security officers from campus. It is important to view this in the context of New York today, where the city continues to invest in its enormous and exorbitantly funded police force that is waging war on Black New Yorkers, at the same time as the organized abandonment of CUNY disorganizes an institution that is foundational to the city, particularly for working class Black and Indigenous communities and communities of color. I'll turn it over to Mel now.
Thanks, Lucien, and thanks everyone for being here today. I was just going to share a little bit more about what our organizing work looks like today and how it looks in the new realm of Zoom. And these are some images of that. And some of the ways we're transforming our community include political education and a mutual aid network. So for the political education piece, before COVID, Free CUNY was already engaged in political education, both internally amongst our members, as well as externally toward our campus community as a means of growing our movement and organizing toward campus strikes. As previously mentioned, CUNY's radical history provides numerous examples of how direct action, strike, and other demonstrations successfully meeting the demands of students in the past, such as our SEEK program, Ethnic Studies Department. And there are many examples from within CUNY, but also other international student movements that we can learn from. And so we use political education as a way to cultivate this abolitionist politic, both in ourselves as individuals, but also as a community of activists. And we have used and are planning to use teach-ins, webinars, zines, and social media as a tools of political education, from reading and listening, watching things together. And recently we've discussed breaking down our city's budget as a way of both understanding and then sharing out accessible information to our community. In terms of mutual aid, at the start of the pandemic, Free CUNY immediately pivoted our strategies to respond to the urgent needs of students, and we recognized that the institution would not provide for the level of need that the students were facing. So we set up a mutual aid network where students, faculty, and staff could request and offer aid in forms of food, money, and housing. CUNY students are primarily working class students of color who are essential workers, caretakers, parents, and who are already struggling to pay tuition and rent. And in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis, CUNY as an institution had very little channels of communication regarding the public health crisis, and there was a lot of misinformation. For example, we were offered a chancellor's emergency relief grant to students of up to $500, which was based on a lottery system, so it was inaccessible to many students and did not help those who needed it. So instead, Free CUNY responded by fundraising and redistributing over $5,000 to students in need of financial assistance for food, money, and housing. We purchased and delivered groceries to people in need, recognizing that many CUNY students are caregivers living in quarantine with older or immunocompromised folks who are unable to go to stores to receive necessary food and household items. Since delivery services are upcharging during this time, we've been trying to fulfill that gap. And in addition, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, Free CUNY took on the accountability of redistributing wealth and resources to Black-led organizations, and we sent $200 in donations to various groups. We've also launched a community support system via social media where we accept requests directly from Black community members on a weekly basis so that our followers can support them directly. And for our conclusion, I'm going to turn it back over to Hailey.
Thank you, Mel. Okay, so Free CUNY started last year on July 1st, and since then we have emphasized the importance of building trust beyond the conditions of our institutionally mediated relationships. This trust has and can only be built by refusing the sanctioned political channels presented by the university and its kind. We are rooted and guided by an uncompromising commitment to liberation, which has helped us build a movement fluid enough to respond quickly and creatively to the crises created and sustained by the university. Through this, Free CUNY has and will continue to sustain that trust that we have built and will one day build, because that is worth more than anything the institution has to offer.